In this video, we're going to turn our attention back to the login endpoint, and we're going to set this up to actually generate a JSON Web Token and send it back to the user. We'll also do the exact same thing for signing up. If you just signed up, you shouldn't have to log in order to start doing things. We know you're that user because we just created your account. So both of these requests are going to end up sending back JWT authentication tokens. That means we don't want to write all of the code for generating the token right here in either of the handlers because we would need to duplicate it to both places. Instead, we'll create another function we can reuse whenever we need to generate an authentication token for a given user. Now, we're going to go ahead and use the function before we define it so we can see what we're getting ourselves into. Right here, we're going to create a function that returns the token, and that token will get sent to the user. We'll modify the send call below in just a second. We can create that function to return a promise, so we will use await to actually get the token back, since that function is going to do asynchronous things. And right here, this function, it's not going to be accessible on uppercase U user like we did with find by credentials. This makes sense when we're not working with an individual user, but we're working with the user collection as a whole. In this case, though, we're trying to generate a token for a very specific user, so we're going to set up the method to live on the user instance, which in this case would be user defined right here. So that would be user dot, and then we can pick whatever name we'd like for our method. Let's go ahead and use something like generate auth token. So we're going to call generate auth token. That'll generate the token for this user. It'll give us the token back, and we can send that back to the requester. So let's go ahead and actually start to put some of this into practice by figuring out how we can create a new method for an instance of user. To do that, we're going to head over to the user models file once again. Now down below, we already created something similar that was find by credentials. Up here, we'll add the new method. We'll start off with user schema, as we will be setting something on there, but instead of user schema.statics like we had down below, it's going to be user schema, and we're accessing methods. From here, we can set up a new method, and right here, we'll call that what we called it in our other file. That was generate auth token. And I will set this up as a standard function since we are going to need to use the this binding like we did with our middleware down below. So I will use an async function, not an async arrow function. And right here, we'll have access to the ability to write that code. So static methods are accessible on the model, sometimes called model methods. And our methods are accessible on the instances, sometimes called instance methods. So let's go ahead and actually fill this out to generate and return a token. So we're calling this on a specific user, and we get access to that user via this, much like we did for our middleware function. So const user equals this is a good way to get started, allowing us to access user instead of this. This line, not necessary. It just makes life a little bit easier. And the next thing we're going to do is generate a JWT using JWT.sign. So up top, let's go ahead and load this in first. A new const JWT, which gets its value from requiring the following JSON Web Token. Now, once we have the require call in place, we can actually use the method down below. So right here, we know we're going to get our token back as we did in index.js. And we'll be using JWT.sign to provide our payload and our secret. We can pick whatever value we'd like for the secret. I'll use the same value I had used before. This is my new course. So right here, this is my new course. Next up, we have to provide a payload that uniquely identifies the user. And here, we're just going to use their ID. So we'll set underscore ID equal to. We'll then use user dot ID, and remember, this is an object ID, so I'll use toString to convert that to a standard string, which is what JWT is expecting. So now we actually have a token created, and we can go ahead and return it from this function. So right here, I'm going to use return to return the token, and now we can test things out. I'll save the user model. I'll save the user router to make sure this code is actually running. And all we're going to do is change what we're sending back. Currently, we're just sending back the user. Instead, we're going to send back an object with two properties. One, the user property, will still contain all of that user data, and the other, the token property, will contain our token. So here I'm using the shorthand syntax to define both properties. I'm going to save the program, and we'll head over to the login request in Postman once again. So over here, I have that login request, and in the previous video, it did work as expected. We got our user data back. I'm going to go ahead and send it off again without making any changes to it, and things still work. We still get a 200. Down below, though, we have user data on the user property, and we have our authentication token down below. So at this point, we're providing the authentication token to the client, and the client can now take this and make other requests that require authentication. Now, currently, no request requires authentication, but we'll work on fixing that shortly. Now, one thing you'll notice about the current setup is that we're not keeping track of this token value anywhere on the server. The server simply generates it with the correct secret and sends it back. Now, this has an important implication. Users can't truly log out. This token, as long as it exists, means the user is logged in. So if it gets in the wrong hands, a user has no way to log out and invalidate a given token. We can go ahead and fix that by tracking tokens we generate for users. This will allow a user to log in from multiple devices, like their laptop and a phone, then they'd be able to log out of one while still being logged in to the other. So all we're going to do is store all of the tokens we generate for a user right as part of the user document. Let's go ahead and knock that out to wrap up the video. Now, to start this feature, we're going to head over to users, and for the first time in a long time, we're going to add something new on to each individual user. We have name, email, password, and age. Down below, we'll add another field. This one is going to be called tokens, and tokens is actually going to be an array of objects. So right here, we set up an array with one item, an object, and right here, we can define what each object should look like. Each object is going to have fields of its own, similar to age, password, email, and name, and in this case, we're just going to have one. Each token in that tokens array will be an object with a single field called token. Token is going to be a string, so I'll set type equal to string like I've done plenty of times before for other Mongoose fields, and it's also going to be required. So if you're going to add a new item to the tokens array, it needs this property. Right here, I'll set required equal to true. Now, there's no need for any other validation since this is a value that'll always be provided by the server. So there's no need to do anything like trim it since it's not something the user is typing in or providing in any way whatsoever. All we're doing here is providing us a way to store an array of objects. Each has a token property. It is the token we're trying to track. Now, down below, we can add the newly generated token to this tokens array. Let's go ahead and get that done. We're going to make a change to the function we just created, that is generate auth token, and right here, after the token is created, we're going to add it to that array, and we're going to save the user, making sure that token shows up in the database. All that means for us is we will be concatenating the item onto the array, so I'm going to set user.tokens equal to, here we'll use user.tokens.concat to concatenate on a new item that'll be an object with the token property defined, which is exactly what we said we had an array of when we defined it up above. Right here, the token property will get its value from the token variable, so I'll use the shorthand syntax to define that. Now, the only other thing we should do is make sure that we call save so the token does get saved to the database. I will await a call to user.save, and there we go. Now we are generating tokens, and we're also saving them to the database. So once again, from Postman, I'm going to log in as the user. I'm going to see that the request works, and I do indeed get a new token back. And now I'm also getting back a tokens array with the stored tokens. Now, like password, this is something we're going to hide and clean up very shortly, but for now, it's okay that it's coming back. What I want to do is head over to the database, so I'm going to crack open Robo3T. I'm going to refresh that user's collection, and since I had deleted the database shortly, this is actually the only user I have. Right here, we have a single token. If I go ahead and expand the record, I can take a look at the tokens array. I have one item with a single property token. Now you'll notice that my token document, the object in my array of objects, it actually has an object ID of its own. This is known as a subdocument, and subdocuments, like regular documents, also have an object ID automatically generated for them. Now, we're not going to use it, but it is indeed there, and I wanted to explain why it's showing up alongside of the property that we actually configured. So now, the login request actually generates and stores an authentication token, and it sends it back to you. From here, we're going to go ahead and do something similar for the sign up request up above, and it's actually going to be your challenge for the video. What I'd like you to do is have the sign up request also send back a new authentication token. So when a new user creates an account, they shouldn't need to provide their credentials once just to provide them again right away to log in. So sign up will also generate and return an authentication token. So right here, step 1, generate a token for the saved user. So after we save the user and we know their data is valid, you're going to generate the new token using the function we've already created. Then you're going to make sure to send back both the user and the token as the response body. And finally, you'll test your work. Create a new user in Postman and ensure that you get a token back. Take some time to knock that out, test your work, and when you're done, click play. How'd that go? I'm going to kick things off with step number 1. I want to generate a token for the saved user, and I'm going to do that right here after the user is saved. That'll be a call to user.generate auth token, and we know we get the token back, so let's create a variable for it. Const token equals whatever comes back from the function. Now, that function is indeed asynchronous, so once again, we'll use await exactly like we had done down below. Next up, we want to modify send to send back the user and the token. Right here to do that, we'll send back an object with both of those as properties. User first, then after that, token. The last thing to do is to test our work. I want to create a new user from Postman and ensure they do indeed have an authentication token associated with them. So for this, I will head back over to Postman. We'll go to our create user request. Now this email is already taken, so I'll just add 2 after it. So now it's andrew2@example.com. I'll fire off that create user request. I get a 201 down below, which is great, but what's even better is that I'm getting a token showing up. So this would be an authentication token that the new user can now use to do authenticated things.